unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. India is home to over 200 million Dalits, formerly known as Untouchables, who have historically occupied the bottom rung of the Hindu caste hierarchy. In recent decades, however, Dalits have experienced unprecedented political and social mobilization. But across India's states, the collective action undertaken by this historically marginalized community has been highly uneven. This is the argument of a brand new book by the political scientist Amit Ahuja titled Mobilizing the Marginalized, Ethnic Parties Without Ethnic Movements. Amit is a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and one of the wisest voices on Indian politics, social change, and foreign policy. I am very pleased to welcome him to the podcast for the very first time to talk about his brand new book. Amit, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you for those kind words.
So I'm pleased to have you on the show this week, but I'm very sad that your service dog, Tashi, is not here today.
Yes, but the good news is that Tashi is all well and will be out of surgery this evening. And, next time when I'm here, you will see me with him.
Okay, because it's usually a 2-for-1 gig here.
Yes,
and
yes.
I'm looking
I've come to understand that. Yes,
looking at our producer, Lauren Duick, I think we need to have a dog in here every week. I think that would raise the standards of the show.
Yes.
Amit, we have a lot to talk about in the book, and congratulations. I had a chance to read it from cover to cover this weekend. But before we kind of get into the real substance, let me just sort of step back for a second. I think we often talk about caste as this kind of abstract concept, but it is strongly ingrained into people's lived experiences, into their daily lives. In the preface of this book, you write, and I'm going to quote you, "Humiliation has defined Dalits' relationship with the rest of Indian society." Especially, I think, for our international listeners, help break down for us, what has been the historical position that Dalits have held in Indian society.
So, as you explained in your introduction, it's just, Dalits lie at the bottom of the Hindu social order. And that's the caste system, which is an occupationally defined social order in which there are certain castes that are associated with ritual purity and therefore enjoy a higher status. Others are associated with lower levels of ritual purity. So, for example, the priestly, the warrior castes are seen as higher castes. Those associated with farming, craftsmanship, artisan castes, those are seen as lower castes. Dalits actually lie beyond these. Their occupations were seen as so polluting that they were treated as untouchables. And so they lie at the bottom of this caste hierarchy, and this sense of pollution that stigmatizes them then also manifested in their lives. They were kept away from, in terms of their habitation. They were treated as untouchables. In some places, their touch was seen as polluting. In other places, even their shadow was regarded as as polluting. So it's in that sense, there has been this long-standing separation and stigma associated with their identity. What is really interesting is that, even though today the relationship between occupation and caste has broken down. So Dalits, for example, are no longer associated with those polluting occupations, for example, with dealing with animal hides or picking up manual waste. Those things have changed. Even then, the stigma has stayed. And that's primarily because caste has reproduced itself as a social order over a 2,000-year-old, it's a 2,000-year-old institution. And for that duration, it's reproduced itself. And what is also interesting is that, in the beginning, I said this is about the Hindu social order. Even Islam, Christianity, Sikhism in subcontinent, religions, faiths that actually differentiate themselves from Hinduism on the count of social equality. Even within these faiths, there is the caste distinction. So there are Muslim Dalits, Christian Dalits, Sikh Dalits. And that stigma comes with humiliation, with this threat of violence, of insults. And what has happened is that over the years, even as the situation of Dalits has changed, the way they are perceived by rest of society, that has still to change substantially. And let me sort of explain this. Dalits, have become assertive. They've mobilized. They don't accept the stigma associated with their caste. But identity, as we know, is not about not just about how you see yourself, but it's also about how others see you. And in that sense, even though Dalits have broken away from their polluting occupations, they have been educated, they have become assertive politically, socially, others still see the stigma around their caste, and it's very difficult for them to escape that. They still end up being seen just as Dalits.
So let me stop you there, because I think, one of the things I wanted to ask you, I don't think I've ever asked you this, is, why did you decide to take the subject of Dalits up and their kind of social and political mobilization? Why was this the topic of your book? What led you to this choice?
So there are, there are different reasons that sort of.
Other than you had to do a PhD dissertation.
That is correct. That is correct. So even when it comes to PhD dissertation topics, the topic that I sort of got interested in intellectually, when I was going through my undergraduate work in India, that was a time in the 1990s where lower caste politics was ascendant. And what was really interesting is that by the time I started my PhD at the University of Michigan, there's a lot of literature that had appeared on lower caste assertion, and when I began my work, I wanted to sort of see what were the effects of this lower caste assertion, especially political and electoral assertion that we'd seen in the 1990s and during the 2000s. So that's what sort of got me interested. But the more I read, what also struck me was that growing up, whether it was in high school or it was in an undergraduate program in economics, somehow the question of caste and the effects of caste discrimination, the sort of structural disadvantages that come with it, those were just never a part of one's curriculum. And when I read up on Dalits, it was very obvious that looking back on the history, the culture, they were just absent. They were not a part of the story in India. These things were changing, in the early 2000s, and that there's no denying that. But it was very, I was very struck by how my upbringing and how my education did not focus on this story at all.
And when you think about the book, there's sort of a central puzzle that animates the whole thing, right? Where you have, in some instances, ethnically Dalit parties. These are pro-Dalit political parties.
Right.
And they have performed very poorly in some states.
Right.
And these are precisely the states where historically they have mobilized socially quite successfully.
Right.
On the other hand, you kind of have the mirror image, right? You have political parties who represent Dalits who do very well electorally, but there's no history of social mobilization. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and you spend the entirety of the book doing it. But I'm just wondering, when you talk about social mobilization, electoral mobilization, what did these mean to kind of a layperson?
I distinguish between two forms of mobilization, as you point out. So social mobilization, I see as the mobilization is the organization that people get, they are involved in on an everyday basis. This is about organizing, coming together, telling stories about one's group, accomplishing small tasks in one's neighborhood, celebrating festivals, getting involved in one's community. So social mobilization is an everyday form of mobilization where people come together. It is sort of ongoing. It is a form of collective action. It brings people together. It requires a level of organization and coordination. And I study this at the neighborhood, locality level. And it is different and very distinct from electoral mobilization, which is primarily focused on the act of voting, supporting parties. Uh, Electoral mobilization, by contrast, occurs around elections. It's the 2, 3, 4 week period before the elections, and once elections are done, electoral mobilization is done, whereas social mobilization continues.
But when you have, I guess, this is the thing that I think strikes me as the most counterintuitive part of the book, where you have a marginalized group like Dalits, where you have social mobilization that has come before electoral mobilization. The success of this group's electoral mobilization seems to be curtailed. And I think that's not what one would expect, right? If you have a base that's socially mobilized, it seems natural that you can use that platform, those linkages, those networks, to leverage them electorally. Why is this happening? Why is the social mobilization, in some sense, undermining or limiting the electoral mobilization that's possible?
See, social mobilization, the way I see it, it performs a very important function, which sometimes we don't appreciate as much in political science, because we're so focused on what parties are doing. And what I find is that what social mobilization does, especially in a marginalized group, when it begins to organize itself, it protests, it demands, it comes together, it performs two basic important functions. One, it produces a cohort of mobilizers who know how to organize the group, who are articulate in terms of their representing group interests. And second, it also produces the demands, the symbols of that group, which are actually absent given its marginalization. These are not symbols and demands which are there in the public sphere. Once this work is done and you have a competitive party system, multi-ethnic parties who want to basically expand their vote share are going to take on these demands, recruit these mobilizers to get the votes of this group. So the marginalized group, the social mobilization actually lays the groundwork for the incorporation of and mobilization of the marginalized group by multi-ethnic parties, right? That's the work that social mobilization does. Now, when ethnic parties appear, and ethnic parties, or for that matter, new parties, when they appear, they're looking for electoral opportunities, right? And in India, this opportunity, for example, appears in the early 90s. The Indian party system is fragmenting. The Congress is declining. There are new parties coming up across the country. And we see that Dalit parties are begin to appear and compete in different parts of the state, different parts of the country. But what is interesting is that where social mobilization had occurred, Dalit demands, Dalit symbols, Dalit party workers, Dalit mobilizers in Dalit localities had already been incorporated in the multi-ethnic mainstream parties. So when the Dalit party began to compete, it was not bringing new demands or new ideas to the mobilization process. It was also, its party workers were also competing with Dalit party workers from other parties. So it found the going really difficult, because in these two states that I look at, Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra, that had experienced historical social mobilization, in these two states, this work of getting the demands and party workers and mobilizers into mainstream parties had already been done.
Right. I mean, I'm glad you brought up these states, because the book is kind of broken into two parts. On the one hand, you look at Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, where you had Dalit social mobilization that did not lead to electoral success for their parties. On the other hand, you have Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, two North Indian states where you have very powerful pro-Dalit parties, but not a lot of social mobilization. Now, these are important states. I mean, they have huge Dalit populations. They just have huge populations more generally.
Correct.
I'm wondering if we could maybe just walk through one state. Let's just take Tamil Nadu, for example, to kind of give our listeners kind of a tangible, concrete example of what you're talking about. So we have a pro-Dalit party called the VCK. It's been around for a long time, and yet it's a pretty minor kind of bit player in party politics.
Right.
How did that come to pass?
So the VCK has, as you said, it's been around for a while. And VCK begins to compete and compete seriously in Tamil Nadu politics as the politics of that state is fragmenting. And that's something that I talked about earlier. But and what does VCK actually need for its success? It needs Dalits, who are 1/5 of the state's population, to support the party in large numbers. If that feat is achieved, VCK is a serious player in the state's politics. Right? In a fragmenting party system, when VCK goes to Dalit localities to mobilize Dalits, it runs into a problem. And the problem is that there are party workers, Dalit party workers from different parties that the VCK party worker has to compete with. The VCK party worker talks about Dalit rights, Dalit recognition. The VCK party worker wants to fight the election in the name of Ambedkar, who's a big civil rights icon related to Dalits. And there, the problem is that these things are already there. These are already a part of the political landscape.
So they've already been kind of appropriated and mainstreamed.
Absolutely. And what is even more interesting is because they have been, even at the locality level, because Dalits are voting for different parties, even though they are very conscious of their Dalit identity, they are actually not voting their caste.
Right.
Right? And so that because that vote is split. This is not a consolidated vote. Now, if you're not interested in voting your caste, the vote is, and your ethnic party comes knocking, and those demands and symbols are already there in the mainstream, then it becomes very difficult for Tiruma Vallavan, who leads the VCK, to make that case of the kind that leaders in Uttar Pradesh in the north or Bihar in the north have been able to make.
So this is basically the mirror image of the story of the BSP, which is the pro-Dalit party headed by Mayawati, who is one of India's most well-known politicians, also one of its foremost Dalit leaders. Is it fair to say that the BSP's rise essentially is the kind of inverse of this story? That, you had no previous political party that fully incorporated Dalit demands, and so then the BSP comes around and it's able essentially to occupy that space.
Yeah, so that's part of the story, that when the party system fragments and the BSP comes around, it is in some ways the first mover in terms of articulating Dalit demands for recognition, for as an equal group as compared to other castes. But there's a little bit more to that. It's also taking advantage of the fact that in Dalit localities, because I went and actually looked at how the mobilization process works. And what I found is that in Dalit localities in Uttar Pradesh, there were basically very few party workers from other parties who were present prior to the arrival of the BSP. So then in some ways, BSP goes in, starts appointing, recruiting party workers. And this is for the first time some of these localities have actually had party workers from the Dalits. So it's not like people have not come to mobilize them.
Right.
That has happened. But they have been from outside. Right? So these have actually been Dalits who've lived in cities, or most of the times it's been members of other castes who've come in and mobilized them. So in that sense, it is taking advantage of the articulation of Dalit demands the first time. It's also appointing and recruiting Dalit party workers for the first time, and then most importantly, because these Dalits who are living in these localities are voting together. They really have, these votes have not been split by different parties prior to the arrival of the BSP.
So you have a much more of a kind of block-style voting.
Yes, absolutely. So these blocks have actually been preserved, because had these groups been mobilized socially, what social mobilization in that sense does, it signals to different parties that, hey, we are mobilized, we are organized as a group. You want to woo us, you want our votes, you've got to incorporate our demands, right? And the longer is that process, more party workers you will find in a locality.
Right. There are a lot of really stunning pieces of data in the
Yeah.
book. And there's a question that you look at, which comes from, I believe it's a CSDS survey.
Yes.
How many people in a state can recognize the picture of B.R. Ambedkar, who, as you mentioned, is the most famous Dalit icon? He's called the father of the Constitution. Now, in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra, twice as many people, I think it's 88%, can recognize his picture compared to the residents of Bihar and UP, which is a kind of stunning number. What do you take away from this discrepancy?
No, and what is even more interesting about this number is the fact that this survey was done after the UP government had undertaken a project of putting Baba Saheb Ambedkar's statues across
the state, yeah.
right? And it's just what it sort of tells you really is that the familiarity with Ambedkar is far stronger and has been around for a longer time in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. I actually probed this even more because it is not just about recognizing Ambedkar's picture.
Yeah.
Right. During my work, I actually went and looked when I was in the localities in which I worked. I started counting the localities in which Baba Saheb Ambedkar's birthday and death anniversaries were being celebrated. And what I discovered was that far more localities in Uttar Pradesh, in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu were observing his birth anniversary. People knew about him. They knew about his achievements, his contributions, why he was important for Dalits. And these anniversaries were being celebrated from within the localities, and different parties, actually their party workers, contributed to these celebrations. What was interesting in UP and Tamil and Bihar was that in Uttar Pradesh, fewer localities observed the birth anniversary. People knew that he was an icon. He was important for the community, but they didn't know why.
Right.
They did not know his association with Dalit history that much. And importantly, the celebrations were sponsored by the BSP. Other parties did not take part in it. And where the BSP presence was weak, I did not spot these celebrations.
So the main part of your book is sort of understanding why you get this different variation and kind of social political mobilization. But that's just one part of it. You then shift to look at what impact does this have on welfare, which is ultimately, I think, the thing that a lot of us care about. And here, again, I guess somewhat unexpectedly, where you have electorally powerful, significant pro-Dalit parties, welfare outcomes actually lag behind places where they're absent. Now, why is it that parties like the BSP in Uttar Pradesh or the Lok Janshakti Party in Bihar, these are, again, pro-Dalit parties, why can't they translate this political power into better outcomes for the people they represent? I mean, they have the votes, they have the seats, they have the chief minister, they have the cabinet. Why doesn't A lead to B?
You're absolutely right. And that really is puzzling. It's also something that I'd actually expected. That's the question
Well, if you know about these states, you know that they continue to lag behind.
They do. But this is the interesting thing. So what I look at is, so if I just compare Dalits in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and for example, with Dalits in Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, you could sort of say, hey, these states lag behind.
Yeah.
And so therefore that's expected. But the way I look at it slightly differently. I compare the Dalit welfare indicators with the welfare indicators of others within the same state. So what I look at is not a cross-state comparison of Dalits, but actually the gap that is there between Dalits and others across these states.
I see.
And what I find is that the gap has actually either not narrowed or expanded in Bihar and UP, despite the fact that you've had stronger performance of Dalit parties in these states. And the fieldwork actually showed up the three reasons for this. One is that there is outside the party, whether it's the BSP, the Bahujan Samaj Party in Uttar Pradesh, or the LJP, the Lok Janshakti Party in Bihar, there is actually very little social vigilance that is there among Dalits. So, which is to say, when things go wrong, when things are not delivered as promised, the agitation levels, whether it's small protests, it's petitioning behavior, that social vigilance is absent because social mobilization levels at the locality level are much lower in these states.
And these are the things that are happening between elections, as you said.
Yes, absolutely. And then second is this issue of, ultimately we have to remember that Dalits are still mostly poor. And when it comes to the poor, holding government officials, holding your own parties that you support, holding them accountable on promises becomes more difficult, right? And so if you want to sort of, in political science, we use the word clientelism.
Yeah.
Dalits in that sense are weak clients, even when it comes to their own parties. So as a counterfactual, if this was an ethnic party, was a caste-based party of, let's say, a wealthier caste group,
Right.
I think the accountability would have been better.
Okay.
So that is but most importantly, thirdly, for Dalits in these states, and let's talk about BSP, which has actually been in power in UP, right? The fact is that elections are a lottery. If the party wins, they're in power, you will get access to the state. And when the party loses, you have no access, right? And, the party is not going to win all the time. And, so what we've seen is, we've seen projects, policies being implemented, but there's no continuity. And where Dalits for example, in Tamil Nadu, in Maharashtra, where they actually split their votes between parties, there's far more policy continuity because parties themselves don't know, how particular group of Dalits or, in a locality, how Dalits are going to vote and who's going to vote for them. And so in that sense, nobody wants to alienate the group. And so those policies, those projects, they continue even as governments alternate.
So Amit, let me bring this story, if I can, to the present. So we've just had a major election in 2019. This is kind of where you end your book.
Right.
We've seen unprecedented levels of support from India's Dalits for the ruling party, the BJP.
Right.
We see the continued marginalization of smaller Dalit parties like the VCK, but we also see the marginalization of previously successful parties like the BSP of Mayawati.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you could just kind of take a step back and answer the question of, what is the state of Dalit politics in the aftermath of the 2019 general election? How would you sum it up?
So I think the 2019 election throws up very interesting patterns which have been developing for a few elections now. So, if you go back by 3 elections, you have Dalits, I think the vote percentage for the BJP, the support was at 10%.
Right.
Then it went up to 25 in 2014. And now it's up to about 34%. Right, so you're absolutely right. Then the percentage of support has gone up for the BJP. But here is the interesting part of the story, I think, which is that I think the BSP is still holding on to some of its vote shares, and I think that is interesting because, the ground level conditions, which I assume in some ways of when I went for the study that I've conducted, have been that the party system needs to have that openness. It needs to be fragmented. And, what we're seeing is the party system is less fragmented as compared to what the situation was earlier.
Right.
Right. So that opportunity, the electoral opportunity, for that matter, for a party like the BSP, which is a caste party, or any other caste party, is shrinking.
And this has happened as the BJP has become the new hegemon,
new hegemon
that the Congress once was.
Yes.
Yeah.
But on the other side, what is really, I think, worth noticing is how the BJP has mobilized Dalits, right? So these are not Dalits who are just voting for the BJP out of just sheer opportunism. Some of that may be going on. But the BJP on its own has put in a considerable effort, especially in terms of using Dalit symbols, using Ambedkar, for example, and how Prime Minister Modi, uses Ambedkar, the commemoration of Ambedkar, memorization of Ambedkar. There are lots of steps that the BJP has taken to to conduct this outreach towards Dalits. So it's not, there's a clear strategy at play here.
So could I dig a little deeper on this
Yeah.
point? So, we had Rahul Verma on the show, I think back in the first season, who made the point that, the support the BJP gets from Dalits
Right.
is contrasted with the fact that the party has relatively few prominent Dalit faces. So if you look at who votes for the party, who comprises the party at its leadership level, this contradiction is eventually going to blow up in the party's face. And I'm wondering if you agree with that. And if you do, or even if you don't, what are some of the other factors that could maybe challenge the BJP and its control over Dalit votes?
So I think I see Rahul's point, and let me also sort of explain why this the sort of the rationale behind this point, because given that most of the BJP's support today comes out of North India, not entirely, but still a lot of its electoral support comes out of North India, and across some of these North Indian states, there is caste-based block voting. And if you're voting as a bloc, then you're looking for leaders. Then caste matters. The caste of the leaders matters in elections, right? So then it is important for the BJP to start worrying whether they have Dalit faces or not,
right?
But on the other hand, what my work shows and unearths is that many Indian parties are leader-centric parties. And in such leader-centric parties, there are other ways of mobilizing caste groups. One is you use their symbols, you use their demands, you recognize them, acknowledge them.
And you use their language,
and
right?
Use their language. And that, to a certain extent, we see that the BJP is doing in the north. But the Congress in Maharashtra has been doing this for decades. Right? And that's the interesting part, that they didn't do this in one state in the north, but they were doing this in Maharashtra.
Right.
And similarly, the Dravidian parties and other parties have been doing this in the south. That's one. Second, recruiting widely at the base.
Yeah.
So it's not just about who do you have in a cabinet, in a state cabinet, or who do you have in the national cabinet, but also, how widely do you recruit party workers among the group in their locality? So does the party have a face proximate to the voter? Right? That matters. And then third, of course, which we are already seeing. So where the BSP doesn't have a face within the party, they ally with a prominent face. So, for example, they have maintained a relationship with Ram Vilas Paswan in Bihar.
Right. So let me bring this conversation to a close by taking in a very different direction, but it's related.
Yeah.
I can't resist not asking you about a study you did with our mutual friend Susan Osterman. It finds a passing reference in the book. I think it may be the first political science experiment ever to be done on Indian matrimonial and dating websites. It's one of my favorite papers of yours. What's a political scientist like you doing, kind of messing around on matrimonial sites?
Yes, that's an interesting question for many reasons. Including for my wife, who did ask me the same question. What are you doing on matrimonial websites?
And what does this have to do with your research on caste?
Exactly. So, see, the caste question, if you're going to study politics in India, politics does not exist in a vacuum. And especially if you're going to study caste politics, how is caste reproduced? Caste has been reproduced generation after generation because of marriage. People are born into a caste. They marry somebody from within their caste. Their children have the same caste, and that cycle continues. So that relationship between caste and marriage has always been there. And so for me, the reason I was looking at the marriage market is because, I had studied caste-based, I had studied Dalit mobilization, both social, electoral, and Dalit assertion. And what I wanted to see was that, what was the social impact of Dalit assertion?
Mm.
And I want to sort of, come back to that point that I made earlier, which is look, identity, as I mentioned, is about not just about how we see ourselves, but how others see us. And what we did, therefore, in this study is we looked at, the acceptance of grooms belonging to different castes among possible matrimonial partners. So basically, women who are in the marriage market looking for grooms. And all of our grooms, interestingly, and as per the design, basically shared a lot of their characteristics. So whether it's how well, whether it was their education, their income, the kind of family background, their height, all these characteristics. And essentially what we were looking at were people who would be very desirable grooms in the marriage market. So these were high income, upper middle class, very well educated grooms. And so if there was one place in society where we would start seeing the impact of caste going away, it would be in this segment. And when I spoke to some of these grooms,
so these are real grooms. These aren't fake profiles that you made.
These are absolute. These are real grooms found for us by matrimonial agencies. And what I found very interesting is a lot of these grooms, valued their professional identity, the work they were doing, much more than their caste identity. And so that for me was really important. But when it came down to how people responded to them, there was a very clear difference. Despite sharing similar characteristics, the Dalit grooms received far less interest as compared to grooms belonging to backward caste, the intermediate caste, or the upper caste. And, so that was, and it was very clear at that time that, even though these Dalit grooms valued their professional identity a lot more than their caste identity, they were as well educated, as accomplished as other grooms. There were still many people who still perceived them as Dalits first than possible matrimonial matches from a good background or good prospects in life.
So like any good conversation about India, we start with some high-minded topic and we end up about matchmaking and marriage and dating.
It's all about marriage.
Amit, thank you so much for coming on the show. The book is called Mobilizing the Marginalized, Ethnic Parties Without Ethnic Movements. It's been published by Oxford University Press as part of their South Asia series. Always good to talk to you and hope you'll come back soon.
Thank you so much, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.